Have you ever tried to follow a beginner-friendly After Effects tutorial, only to find out it's not beginner or friendly at all? Well, if that's you and you're still looking to learn After Effects, let me go ahead and show you the very first lesson in our masterclass, especially designed for beginners. So, we're going to move this square from one side of the screen to the other. And then we're going to take that and make a simple little logo animation. My name is Tony Ross of TonyTeach.com, where we make beginner-friendly tutorials and masterclasses. The only thing that you need to know is that the software exists and that we're teaching it. So let's go ahead and get started. When you first open up After Effects, this is the window you'll see. So you have options of starting a new project or opening a project. And for the most part, you don't have to start a new project because when you open up After Effects, it already has a composition open or a project open in the background. So I'm simply going to close that little window. And one of the first things I have my students do, and I'll have you do the same, is we'll go to Window, go to Workspace, and we want to make sure the default workspace is selected. And then go to Window, Workspace again, and come down to Reset Default to save layout. Now, in theory, this basically means that we'll all have the same type of workspace when we're starting off here. Now, as far as the interface in After Effects is concerned, this first little area over here is the project area. This is where you will see, well, the different projects you're working on. If you import video or Photoshop files, Illustrator files, audio files, any of those things will be in this area, as well as any compositions, and those are the projects you create inside of After Effects. Any of your compositions will also show up in the project area. The next section to your right here, this is the composition area, and this is where anything you're working on, it's kind of like the big view screen of the compositions you're going to be working on. Any videos or motion graphics, we're going to be seeing it up in this main window here. Lastly, at the bottom, this is our timeline. Now, it's not really active that much right now, but we'll be able to see things where we can change things over time, set up down here on our timeline. All right. And one more thing across the top, this is where our tools are. So let's get started with our very first project in After Effects. To do a new composition, you'll see these large buttons here. I usually don't use these, and the reason is I like my students to use this one little area down here to create a new composition. They do the same thing, but I like people getting used to using this little icon for later when we start working with videos and different imports like Photoshop or Illustrator. So I'll click once on this icon, and we're going to call this Composition Squares. Now for my preset size, I'm going to pretty much set this to a 720p or 1280 by 720 at 29.97 frames per second. And as far as the resolution, I'm not really worried about that, but I do want to change the duration down here at the bottom. And I'll set this to 10 seconds. Now, if you don't see any semicolons here, it basically means that you have your After Effects set up for frames. If so, simply type in the number 300. Otherwise, we're just going to change this to 10 seconds. The reason you would type in 300 is we're at 29.97 frames per second or 30 frames per second, and 300 would be 10 seconds. All right, so we've labeled this squares. We're doing 1280 by 720, 29.97 frames per second, and we're doing 10 seconds, or if you have it set to frames, set it to 300 frames. Go ahead and click OK. Now, the first thing you'll notice is over on our project area here, we can actually see our composition. There's our name, Squares. There's that little icon. And our timeline now says Squares. We can see our timeline or our time code right here. and we can see where the seconds are listed out on the base here. Now, one thing you might notice about the composition area, my screen is very black right now, and this is based off of a old school or traditional video black, meaning it's transparent. What I like to usually use is I'll come down to the base here and click on this little toggle transparency grid. So I have a little checkerboard background, and that lets me know that this area is transparent. Now, for our squares, we're going to make sure we create this one little red square, and then we're going to have it move from one side of the screen to the other. So we'll come up to our tools, and we have our selection tool, hand tool, all these things here. What we're looking for is the rectangle tool, and this is basically going to create a shape layer. So I'm using the rectangle, and we'll come over here to our right. We have the fill, the word, as well as the color here. If we click on the actual text, it will open up so we can actually select a fill, or we can say no fill. But right now we're going to do a solid color. And for the stroke, I'm going to click on stroke here and set this to no stroke. So we have a red fill and no stroke. So what we'll do is we'll come down to our composition area, and on my left-hand side, I'm simply going to click and drag out a small square here. And if I hold down my shift key on my keyboard, it's going to lock in the proportions. So it's like a 1-to-1 ratio here. I'll let go of the mouse, let go of the keyboard. And so I have this little square here. All right. Also, if we look down on our timeline, it says shape layer 1, rectangle, and all of that information is there. Now, one of the first things I want to talk about is a major difference with After Effects that isn't with pretty much any other piece of Adobe software. Normally, you would go to change a name by simply double-clicking right where the text is. But if you do that, you're going to get an alert. Now, in order to change the name of something, we'll select where it says Shape Layer 1, and on your keyboard, hit Return or Enter. And we'll just call this Square. We're Square 1. We'll click off of that. And now I want to select that again. And if we look up in our composition area, we can see that our little square is selected. We also have this little target icon here. This is basically an anchor point. And the way you have to look at, or the way you have to think about an anchor point is if you place a thumbtack or a push pin in a piece of paper, exactly, that's pretty much wherever you place that pin is where it's going to rotate from. If I come over here to this little tool here that looks like basically is our rotate tool, if I click now, you can see that it's rotating from that little dot in the center. I'm going to undo that, Command Z, Control Z on PC. And in order to change where this anchor point is, we'll go to the tool right next to the rotate. And this is our pan behind tool. And I can now click on this little guy and bring this over to the middle. Now, another way to make sure that that anchor point's dead center, I'm going to undo that really quick. On a Mac, if I hold down my Command key and then come up and double click on the pan behind, on PC, if you hold down your Control key and double click on the pan behind, you'll see that that goes dead center. Okay. So far we've made a composition. We've added a shape layer, our simple little square, and we've changed the name of our shape layer and changed where the anchor point is. Now, one of my best definitions I've ever heard, or one of the best definitions I've ever heard of After Effects is that it's Photoshop animated. I'll agree with that, but I'll also say it's Photoshop and Illustrator animated. So these are taking these little things and moving pieces over time, or let's say changing the color or the transparency, anything like that. So what we want to do here is we'll come down to our timeline, And we're going to talk about some of the transform properties that are here. So if I expand this little guy here, we've got anchor point, position, scale, rotation, opacity. Now it sounds like a lot, but let me break it down. If I have square 1 selected, on my keyboard, I'm simply going to press the letter P. That will bring up our position property. So pressing P for position. If I press the letter S, that will bring up scale. Pressing the letter R is rotation. And last but not least is opacity. It's not the letter O, by the way. It's actually the letter T for opacity. All right. So we have P for position, R for rotation, S for scale, and T for opacity. Now, if you'd like to have more than one property showing, you can pretty much press, for instance, P, hold down your Shift key, and then press the letter R. And you can press the letter T as well. So we now have position, rotation, opacity. What we're going to do right now is simply press the letter P, and that'll close everything off. And because we want to animate the position, we'll press P once more. All right, now your numbers might look a little different than mine, but basically these are the coordinates of where things are. So this is the X coordinate and the Y coordinate. X is left to right, Y is up and down. And if you ever forget that, remember that the letter Y has that little thing that goes up and down. So I want to make sure I go to my selection tool, and I'll come down to my timeline, and this little stopwatch here, I'm going to turn this on. Anytime you see the stopwatch, it means that this is a property that can be changed over time. So I'm going to click on this, and several things will happen. You'll notice 1, our stopwatch is blue. And 2, we also have this little diamond or a little square on its side. That little marker there basically means that is a keyframe. Now, what a keyframe is, in case you don't know, it's kind of the start or stop of an action. Let's say if we have our square on one side of the screen, that's going to be our first keyframe. And once we move it to the other side of the screen later on in our timeline, that will be another keyframe. All right. So you can do keyframes with, let's say, opacity, color. You can do things with the scale, but you're just moving these pieces around. So we have our keyframe here. And one thing I would like to do is we could move this right up to about 2 seconds. Or what I would like to do instead, I think I want to actually do something with frames. Now, if I did want to use 2 seconds, I could simply highlight our time code over here and just type in 200. It goes to 2 seconds. If I wanted 6 seconds, type in 600. All right, works the same way. What I would like to do, though, is instead of using our time code, I want to use frames instead. So on a Mac, I'm going to hold down my Command key and click on our time code. And it shows us we're at frame 180. At the bottom, it still shows us where we are seconds-wise. All right. Now, the reason I'm doing this, I want to go to frame 75. So it's approximately 2.5 seconds. All right. So we moved our playhead out to 2.5 seconds. And now what we're going to do with our square, making sure we're on our selection tool, I want to move the square from the right-hand side to the left-hand side. Or at least that's stage right. If you're just facing it normally, it's from your left-hand side to the right side. Now, I don't want to touch the little bounding squares here. I'm just going to click anywhere in the red area. By the way, if I use my scroll wheel on my mouse, I can zoom in here. I'm just clicking somewhere in the red area here and dragging this over to the right side. And if I hold down my Shift key, it will lock that in horizontally. Let go of the mouse, let go of the keyboard. All right. So you should see these little lines here, as well as there are 2 keyframes on our timeline. Now, if I click on the playhead and drag this, by the way, that's called scrubbing. I can see that moving. or I can simply press the spacebar on my keyboard to watch that move. All right, now let's have a little fun here. The first thing I want to do is this little piece is actually 10 seconds long, but we don't need all of the time on this timeline, at least not right now. So I do want to shorten this to about, let's say, frame 150. And the way we can do that, there's this little gray bar right at the top. This is called our work area. And I can click and drag this over and shorten it that way. Now, there are shortcut keys to the work area, but I show those later. So now if I hit my space bar, we see it's just going to 150 and then looping again. I hit space again to stop, bring my playhead back to the beginning. And what I'd like to do is create a duplicate of the square here. So on my timeline, if I select the square one, on my keyboard, I'll simply do Command D, that's Control D on PC. And if you notice, it's actually even numbered this for us. So it's square 2. And we're not going to see any difference because they are identical. So what I want to do is at the beginning, I'm going to click on this red square and I'll move it right above the initial one. All right. Now I'm going to go to frame 75 and I'll again take this little red square, this is our duplicate, and move this one above. So now if we play, we should have 2 squares moving. All right. Now let's have a little more fun with this. What we want to do is change how this works. Right now, it's pretty much evenly moving across 75 frames. And you can see these little dots. Those represent our frames here. So on square 2, if I press P for position, I'll be able to see the keyframes. And they're identical to the original square one because we did make a duplicate of it. But what I would like for you to do is select that first keyframe. The way you can do that is simply click and drag, make a little selection rectangle there. And you can either use your shortcut keys to do this, which is pressing F9 on your keyboard, or if you right click, you would come down to Keyframe Assistant and then go to Easy Ease. Now, what this basically means is the square is going to move slow at the beginning and then speed up. So if you look, the dots look a little different up here. Now, if I hit spacebar to play, you'll note that that little square, that second square, is moving slower, but it does eventually catch up. Now, what I'd like to do is select that second keyframe of square 2 and do the same thing. I'm going to use my shortcut key of F9, but if your function keys aren't working, you can simply right click again, go to Keyframe Assistant and do Easy Ease. And now when we play this, you'll notice something very different about that second square. All right. And last but not least, let's have a little fun with this. What we can do is come up to our tools here and select the pen tool. And when it comes to the movement here, I've got my playhead at the beginning. I can click on the second square here and click and drag, and it's going to basically bend where my path is as far as where this is going to animate. So if I play now, all right, and I can do the same on the other one. Just bring that down a little more. All right, and as simple as it is, that is your first little bit of motion graphics and your intro into the program. Now, what can you do with this? Well, we can do a lot. One, I can select where it says squares here, and I'll simply duplicate this composition. So in the project area, I've clicked on squares. I'll simply do Command D, the same command that I actually used on a timeline to duplicate something. And I can double click on the icon here. This opens up squares too. And what if I wanted to change up a few things, like where does the square end? So I'm at frame 75. Maybe I want this to be a little bit on the side here. And zoom out. And maybe I want to have this change as far as the direction. So I'm just bending the direction handles here. And I can duplicate this one to have a third square. Command D, that's Control D on PC. And maybe this square is going to be at the bottom. I can adjust where the curves are. And I definitely want to change where the beginning is, so. All right. And as far as changing one last thing here, we can change not only the rotation, but we can also change the scale. And to do that, what we'll do, let's bring this back to the beginning. So squares 2 and 3, we'll select both of the layers. And we can do that by holding down our Shift key. And I'll first press the letter R for rotation. Now, if you note, square 2 and 3 both have the rotation properties pull up. We'll hold down our Shift key and also press S for scale. All right. So what we'll do now is I would like to set up a keyframe for both square 2 and 3. So I'll click on scale as well as I'll click on rotation. Now I'm at the very beginning here, and what I can do from this point is we'll set the scale, let's say to 10 or maybe even 1. All right. And then we'll go out to frame 75. I can simply highlight this, type in 75, and we'll set the scale to 100. And for rotation, you'll notice there is a number here, like how many times, and then there's how many degrees. What I want to do is at the frame 75 here, we'll change this to rotation of 1. So basically what happens is we now have a simple little animation or motion graphics happening, and it started from a basic square. Now, though this may seem simple, once you understand the basic principles of moving things over time and adjusting different properties, you'll be able to do this not only with images as far as your shape layers, but bringing in videos or adding filters and different plugins to change things over time. And that's what's going to take your motion graphics to another level. So I hope you've enjoyed this very first lesson. And if you'd like to know more, we are hosting live masterclasses in Adobe After Effects 101, and you can sign up with the link in the description. Also, look for the coupon code, and you can actually get a large discount off of the masterclass. Seats are limited, so sign up today. This has been Tony Ross for TonyTeach.com. Remember, make art, not excuses. So go make something. Have a good day.